Hi, everyone. This is Jon Kelsen here at Drisha with Mishnah in Depth, introducing Masechet Bechorot, part of our Mishnah in Depth series, which itself is offered as part of our Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division. All of our Mishnah teachings here at Drisha are dedicated in Rivka's name and memory. Rivka was a beloved student at Drisha and a lover of Mishnah, and these shiurim are dedicated by her family and friends, again, in her name and in her memory. This again is Masechet Bechorot, introduction to Tractate Bechorot, which includes and discusses laws of the firstborn. And this is in Seder Kodoshim. And let me just share a source sheet and try to make a few observations and comments about this tractate to help launch your learning. Again, the Mishnah in Depth series is designed to scaffold and supplement your own independent daily learning of mishnayot, and I hope that this will, frame that learning for you in some helpful ways. So Masechet Bechorot again is part of Seder Kodoshim, the order of the Mishnah dealing with sacred things, as this name implies. Begin with Zvachim and Minachot, animal and grain sacrifices, or discussion of those matters, and immediately preceding Bechorot. And here, this is noticed and attended to already by the introduction of Tosafot Yom Tov, citing the Maimonides, the Rambam in his introduction to Bechorot. Immediately preceding Bechorot is Masechet Chulin. We'll have just finished learning Chulin together with Rabbi Dr. Avi Walfish. Chulin deals with non-sacred meats, the laws of kashrut for meat which is not offered as a sacrifice, but rather is eaten just in a sort of a regular non-sacrificial manner. And then we get to Bechorot, like we say, the laws of the firstborn. So the Tosafot Yom Tov, right off the bat, citing the Rambam, notes that there's a biblical backdrop to this ordering. Achar chulin sider bechorot ala seder hakatuv, that the verse itself, the scripture itself, and here they're referring to Deuteronomy 12, Devarim Perek Yud Bet, first discusses what we call chulin, or basar ta'ava, right? Meat which is eaten because of desire for eating meat and not because of its sacrificial status. But chulin meat, and after discussing what's called basar ta'ava in Devarim Yud Bet, verses 15 and 16, rak b'chol avat nafshecha tizbach v'achalta basar. When you want to eat, whenever you desire and you want to eat meat, so then there's, that you may eat that anywhere that you are, as long as you don't eat the blood. And then in verse 17, this is contrasted with lo tuchal lechol b'sharecha ma'asar b'gancha tiroshecha v'yitzarecha v'chorot b'karcha v'tzonecha v'chol nederecha asher tidor nidvotecha trumat yadecha ki lefnei Hashem lokecha tochlanu b'makom asher b'char Hashem lokecha bo, etc., etc. You may not partake in your settlements of the tithes of the new grain or wine or oil, or of bechorot b'karcha v'tzonecha, the firstlings of your herds and flocks, right? The bechor of your behemot, which is one of the central themes of our tractate. Those have to be eaten by the mikdash, right, in the place that God will choose. And in fact, we understand, right, those are to be offered and sacrificed. So it's interesting, right, for this understanding, the Mishnah has in its backdrop the progression of Devarim Yud Bet from the laws of chulin. Actually, I would add that it says actually to make sure that that your olot and your sacrifices are offered in a central place. So that harkens back to Zvachim already. First, the laws of sacrifices, then basar ta'ava b'chol avat nafshecha. We call that Masechet Chulin, or that is that's picked up in Masechet Chulin, and then Bechorot, among other things. We might call those Matnot Kehuna, things which are given to the Kohen, among other things. and that's picked up in Masechet Bechorot, which is what we're up to here. In terms of Mano Kunhuna, though, it's also worth mentioning, as others have noted. Rabbi Wolfish actually pointed this out to me, but I think I've seen this elsewhere as well, that the law, that Chulin itself includes in its concluding chapters discussion of gifts to the Kohanim, gifts to the priests, matnot kehuna, and Bechorot, right, the Bechor, and fundamentally are things which also are categorized as such, as being as things which belong to the Kohen. So that theme also segues from the end of Chulin into Bechorot. What is Masechet Bechorot about? So Masechet Bechorot discusses three types of firstborns and their all their respective halachot. One, and I'm going out of the order of the presentation in the Mishnah, but I'm just thinking conceptually. One, Bechor Adam, the firstborn male issue of a womb, right? Called Peter Rechem, from a human being. Two, Bechor Behema, the firstborn of a behema Torah, of a kosher animal. And three, what's called, and here I'm highlighting on the screen, Peter Chamor, right, the firstborn of a donkey. These three, which is a non-kosher animal, according to the halacha, refers specifically to a donkey, as opposed to that being an example of a larger set of non-kosher animals. Halacha, according to the halacha, it's only the Peter Chamor specifically, which has these halachot. These are the three types of Bechorot which are discussed in Masechet Bechorot. And let's start here with Bechor Adam. I'll note that if you want to start with Bechor Adam, so the halachot, really, you'll start with what we have here, Exodus 13. Of course, the notion of the import of the Bechor, of the firstborn, the import of the Bechor, the subversion of the rights of the Bechor in favor of the younger child. So that theme begins not in Exodus, but in Genesis. Maybe you might even call it a central motif of Genesis. And it's taken for granted, in fact, that the Bechor has a special status, the firstborn has a special status within the family. Much of the narrative of Genesis is dedicated to sort of determining who will carry forth the covenantal blessings. Will it go to the firstborn child? Will it go to maybe specifically the younger child? And this is not a time to explain that at length, but it's obviously a central theme there. It's also worth noting that in Exodus itself, not only do we speak of the literal firstborn, whether it be the plague of the firstborn in Egypt, as you'll have here as we'll have mentioned in Exodus, but also God speaks of Israel itself writ large as B'ni Bechori, as my firstborn, and God therefore claims Israel. And the point there is that the firstborn, at some level, their special status is connected with their belonging to God. God has a claim inherently, right, on the firstborn. And let's turn here to Exodus 13. This is sort of an excision, right, from the first couple of verses, and then later on, later verses in the chapter. God says to Moses, saying, "Kadesh li kol bechor." Consecrate to me every male firstborn. Kadesh li kol bechor, Peter kol rechem, the first issue of every womb, b'nei Israel, ba'adam u'ba'behema lihu. Whether it be of the human being, of the person, a human being, or of the animal, they belong to me. They are mine. Here I want to note two things. I'll start from the latter, which is that Adam u'behema are juxtaposed. The firstborn of the animal, of the human, and the firstborn of the animals are juxtaposed. And indeed, in Masechet Bechorot, we'll have a discussion of, as I mentioned, the laws of the firstborn of various types of animals, along with the laws of the Bechor Adam, of the firstborn human. That's picking up on or echoing this verse here, Adam Behema, where the two are juxtaposed, right? They're presented together, and that's also paralleled elsewhere in the Chumash, where they're presented together. Interestingly, as a footnote, I'll just point out, as a point of contrast, that when Maimonides codifies the laws of the firstborns, so unlike the Mishnah, he does not group all three together. As a point of contrast, the Rambam codifies the laws of the Bechor Behema Tehora, the kosher animal, in Hilchot Bechorot, which is found in the section of Karbanot, right, or the book of Karbanot, the book of sacrifices, because that the Bechor Behema Tehora, its laws are basically the laws of a sacrifice, right? Its fats and its bloods are offered onto the altar. It is a sacrifice. It is a sacrificial animal, at least fundamentally, and in theory. Obviously, when we don't have a temple, so that's a halachic discussion about how one deals with that. But I'm not going to get into that right now. But that's where the Rambam codifies the laws of the kosher firstborn in Hilchot Bechorot, in the section dealing with laws of sacrifices. He as opposed to that, he discusses the laws of the Bechor Adam, the human Bechor, and the Peter Chamor, the donkey's firstborn, right, the ass's firstborn, in an entirely different section, the laws of Bikurim and other gifts to the Kohen. Bikurim, the same root as Bechorot, but right, the first in that sense, the first fruits, right, the first, right, belongs to God. We see not only the first animal, the first human, but the first. It's a general notion, right? Our first fruits, our bikurim, right? They belong to God as well. And in that section, in the laws of in the book of Zra'im, of agricultural laws and gifts to the Kohen, Matnot Kehuna, so that's where he discusses the laws of Bechor Adam and Peter Chamor. So he specifically distinguishes between and sort of separates, I should say, where he discusses the Bechor of the kosher animal, and not only the Bechor of the non-kosher donkey, but also the Bechor of the person. Now, it makes sense why he would do that, because unlike the Bechor of the kosher animal, the Bechor of the donkey and the human being, so those are redeemed, right? Their sanctity is redeemed because they can't be offered on the altar, right? There's we don't offer the non-kosher animal, and we don't offer human beings, right? Either, of course. So he separates the two, but that just that point, the distinction, if you will, highlights what I think is a point of interest in Mishnah Bechorot, where all three are discussed together, right? And the Mishnah's choice to discuss all three together echoes the choice here. The choice, echoes the precedent and the framing in the Chumash, as in our verse, for example, Ba'adam u'behema lihu. I did also want, I noticed that in the course of Mishnah Bechorot, there's another juxtaposition of the laws regarding, a human being and those of an animal, and that has to do with blemishes. Because in the middle of the tractate, the Mishnah discusses laws of which blemishes render a Bechor animal, unfit for sacrifice. And then it discusses which blemishes, and actually, puts the conversation with many similarities, but some differences with the blemishes of a priest, right, of a human being, which render them, unfit to perform the sacred worship. So there too, it seems like it's another place within the Mishnah, Masechet Bechorot, where the laws of an animal and the laws of the human are juxtaposed and put together. Here also, I was discussing this with Rabbi Wallfish. and he noted that perhaps there as well, the Mishnah is following from the biblical precedent, because in the book this time of Leviticus, Leviticus 12, the Torah speaks both of the laws of an impure or blemished person, right? As well as the laws of a blemished or a blemished animal. So there as well, potentially, we could say that the Mishnah is following off of the precedent and of the structure of the Mishnah the precedent of the scripture and of the Chumash as the structuring itself within the Mishnah proper. This is one thing I wanted to mention again, Ba'adam v'Hema, the way that the Torah puts into conversation, juxtaposes the firstborn of the human being and the firstborn of the animal. Both belong to God. The first belong to God, fundamentally, they belong to God. There's also, the second point I want to point out here is kadeshli, the sense of the sanctity, kodashim, right? The sanctity of the Bechor. And there's a bit of if you will, sort of an intriguing built-in tension to the status of the Bechor, because kadeshli sounds like, right, you have to render it holy, consecrate it to me, as the translation has here, which implies, if you take it, I guess, literally, that if you absent or the act of consecration, it wouldn't be holy. On the other hand, there's a sense of lihu, that it already belongs to God. And this is, I think, an interesting feature of the laws of Bechorot, that on the one hand, they're born, unlike other animals, they are fundamentally, they are born with some sanctity. And on the other hand, there's this commandment to sanctify them. Just to skip ahead to the way the Rambam, Maimonides, at least frames this, and this is a bit of a conversation among the Gemara and among the Rishonim, but he says in the beginning of the laws of Bechorot, mitzvah l'hakadish bechor behema tahora. It's actually a mitzvah, in his opinion, to be makdish, to consecrate, right? To say this, firstborn kosher animal is kodesh, hareza kodesh, takdish l'Hashem Elokecha. This is in Devarim. On the other hand, v'imloach disho hareza mitkadesh me'elav, u'kedushaso me'rechem. On the other hand, if you are not makdish, it already has kedusha inherently from the womb, even without your act of sanctifying it. So there's an interesting feature of Bechorot that yes, according to the Rambam, at least there is a mitzvah to be makdishit, but on the other hand, unlike a regular old animal, which one might want to be makdish and render sacred, it is inherently sacred. Okay, so the Torah says, right, Kaddish kol Bechor kol Pater Rechem in Israel, and so far it's just based, it's not attached to, not given any reason for that law. But as we go on, when you come into the land, you're supposed to then essentially give over, right, any firstborn, including give them over, apparently, to sanctify them, to offer them the Peter Chamor Tevaseh. The Peter Chamor has to either be redeemed, and if it's not redeemed, then it has to be avarafto. It has to be killed, but it can't be used for non-sacred purposes. And and of course you have to redeem any of your firstborn sons rather than offer them. And it'll be that when your son will ask you, your child will ask you, what is this about? And you'll say to him, God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, but when Pharaoh refused to let us go. Hashem kol bechor ben Mitzrayim, bechor adam v'ad bechor behema. God, remember Makat Bechorot, God smote all the firstborns in Egypt, human and animal alike. Al kain ani zovech l'Hashem kol peter rechem zecharim b'chol bechor banakta. And therefore, I am offering to the firstborn of the animals to God, and I need to redeem my sons. And this shall be a sign in your hands. And indeed, this is one of the parshiyot which goes into the tefillin, kadesh li kol bechor. So here, the sanctity of the firstborn is not only because of the inherent sense that all the first things belong to God, but specifically, or that's sort of augmented by the historical association with Makat Bechorot, that sounds like the logic is that when God smote all the firstborns in Egypt at some level, and God therefore spared the Israelite, firstborns. So they owe a debt to God. They, in some sense, God claims them, God belongs them, and therefore they have to be offered back to God. The kosher animals are literally offered. The non-kosher animal has to be redeemed, and of course, the human being has to be redeemed as well. There are scholars who have argued that verses like Ba'adamu behema lihu and other verses, maybe those are indicate that there are biblical, there's a thread of biblical thought which actually knows of or supports human sacrifice. I'm not sure about that. You could also, what's clear is that the human and the animal firstborns are associated, but it could be a sense in which the firstborn is not literally ever imagined to have to be sacrificed, but there's some sense in which they are owed to God, and not literally to be offered. They actually have to be redeemed. And I'll note that there's an echo of this notion of the firstborn being redeemed, but really redeemed from having to be offered. So this probably reminds the reader of, for example, Isaac, right, who is the firstborn. He's not Abraham's firstborn son, but he is Sarah's firstborn son, and the Peter Rechem for Sarah. In fact, the halacha is that when it comes to Bechorot, as opposed to the laws of Nachala, of inheritance, where it's the firstborn of the father who receives the double portion. When it comes to the laws of Bechorot, for our purposes, it's the firstborn of the mother, specifically Peter Rechem. So Isaac there is the firstborn in that sense, and is commanded to be offered. But as we know, of course, is not offered, but he's rather redeemed, if you will. And there's sort of a precedent there for our story as well. Now, the status of the firstborn and the need to redeem him, I think there's a very intriguing Seforno who frames this and takes seriously the comparison with the animal, the firstborn animal. He says as follows, this is in our verse, Kadesh Kol Bechor, Shitchayvu Kulam Bepidyon, Kishar Kol Hekdesh. Just like all other sacred things, the human Bechor needs to be redeemed from its sacred status, in order to be used for non-sacred purposes. Right? Now, or if it was not for the redemption, it would be prohibited to make any secular use, any non-holy use of them. This is really interesting. Seforno seems to be claiming that just like a sacred animal, I think it goes on to say, right, lo tavo b'chor shorcha, right, you might not make secular use, right, non-regular work use of your firstborn ox, just like, and they need to be redeemed. You can accept, if you wanted to, or one wouldn't make use of profane use of holy things. So too when it comes to the human being, a human Bechor fundamentally is sacred, and as so, Kadesh Kol Bechor, right? It's a sacred being, belongs to God. And in order to make use of it in a non-sacred sense, you would have to redeem the person. This is called Pidyon Bechor. Okay, and this is why he explains why we have the institution of Pidyon Bechor, redeeming the firstborn, right? We've been Chodesh Tifdez, we say elsewhere, right? That he had from the time of when he's 30 days old, and he's with the value of 5 shekel, which is, I'll get to Masechet Arachim, but that's the sort of objective value, or when one dedicates the value of a 30-day-old infant to the temple. So you pay that value to the Kohen, and then you can redeem this firstborn. So the Sforno makes the claim that fundamentally a Bechor needs to be redeemed in order for them to live their lives and do work and expend energy on non-sacred things. So fundamentally, that energy, right, their work actually belongs to God. This I'll skip the Sefer Chinuch for now, but this actually this anticipates and fits well with what happens later in the Chumash, where God says in Bamidbar chapter 3, Ani hine lekachti et haleviim mitoch bnei Israel tachat kol bechor peterechem bnei Israel v'hayu li haleviim. God says, I'm replacing the every bechor and their status. I'm taking the Levites in their stead, right? And as the Midrash, cited by Rashi, right? It's actually a well-known Midrash. Argues, "Va'ani mehechan zechiti behem mitoch bnei Israel." When did I take the Leviim? I took them from out of the people of Israel. When who the Bnei Israel, who were Sochrinotan Lashir Sheli, right? Bnei Israel sort of gave them to my service, because idea Bechorot zechiti behem, lekachtim timurotam. Lefi shayta avoda bechorot u'shechatu v'egel nifsalu. V'aleviim shelo avdu avoda zara nivcharu tachteim. So the firstborn belonged to God in the sense that their work, as I said, their service really belonged to God. They were to perform the avodah. This was the assumption the assumption before, according to the Midrash, the sin of the golden calf. At the occasion of sin of the golden calf, when they, along with the rest of Israel, sinned, so God took, they became nifsalut, they became unfit to perform the service, and the Leviim are kind of their redemption or their substitution. Timuratam, says Rashi, perhaps looking forward towards Masechet Timurah in a sense. But they were actually they were substituted for the firstborn, and the firstborn therefore are not fit for the service in the temple. Leviim take their place, but nonetheless, the firstborn at some fundamental level, kili kol bechor, right? Fundamentally, the firstborn belongs to God, and therefore they need to be redeemed. So this is Bechor Adam as well as Bechor Behema. And in the words of the Sefer HaChinuch, who explains the reasoning, Sharshei HaMitzvah, the reasoning for the commandment L'Kadesh Bechorot, he says what we indicated before, Sheratzah Hashem Yitbarach L'Zakotenu L'Asot Mitzvah Bereshit Piryo. God actually helps us understand through this mitzvah regarding the first things. L'man dat ki hakol shalom. This right. In order we should really understand and be aware that everything belongs to God fundamentally. Everything belongs to God, and when one toils, when one really toils and tries to produce a first, whether it be bikurim, first fruits, or the first animals, or especially the firstborn of the human, and the first is of course so dear, he immediately gives it to God, and enters into God's dominion. God's doing. So fundamentally, the giving of the first is a recognition and helps us to become cognizant of the fact that we are everything is God's. We are living in God's world, and certainly the first is to be gifted to God, or said differently, belongs to God already, and hence its sacred status. Okay, so let me just note again that the tractate, right, discusses Bechor Adam, the human being, Bechor Behemat Temeah, which is specifically the firstborn of the Chamor, which is actually how the tractate begins, and then the Bechor Behemat Tehor. So there are 9 chapters in the tractate. Again, the first following off of Chulin, discussing, right, the gifts to the Kohen, is the Peter Chamor, right, the firstborn of the donkey. Then there are several chapters discussing the Bechor Behema Tehora. That's from chapters 2 to 6. In the course of that, we discussed the blemishes of disqualifying blemishes of the Behema Tehora, and that segues into chapter 8, which talks about the mum of the Kohanim, the blemishes of the human being, of the priest, as I discussed earlier. That itself, the chapter about Mumei Kohen, right, I think anticipates and segues into the laws of Bechor Adam, the laws of the firstborn human being. And then because of the some of the similarities between the laws of Bechorot and the laws of Ma'aser Behema, of the animal which is tithe, so the tractate ends with the laws of Ma'aser Behema. So I'll pause here and hope that this framing, which I've been trying to not only give sense of a brief overview of some of the core topics of Masechet Bechorot, but also to account for its placement within Seder Kodashim, specifically following Chulin, and also to stress at greater length some of the interesting, to my mind, features of this whole tractate, the inherent sanctity of the Bechor as opposed to the purely constructed sanctity of the Bechor, and the juxtaposition of Bechor Adam and Bechor Behema, the firstborn animal and the firstborn of the human being. I think we leave sort of the reader to think more about, what do we make of that juxtaposition? To what extent are the Bechor Adam, Bechor Behema parallel? To what extent different? But I'll pause here and leave that for your learning. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.